what do you think is going to happen if Trump comes in and says, we want a ceasefire, and that's one of his initial negotiating positions, and the Russians just say no?
They're not going to get a ceasefire. The Russians would be nuts to agree to a ceasefire. They're on a roll. Why would they agree to a ceasefire, which would give the Ukrainians and the West a time to reconstitute the forces and get ready to fight against the Russians in much better shape than they are now? So there's not going to be a ceasefire. I think there are two ways this can play out. One is that the Trump administration agrees to Putin's demands and you get an agreement, you get a peace agreement. And the two main demands here are, number one, that NATO, that Ukraine never becomes a part of NATO, that Ukraine is a neutral state. That's demand number one. And demand number two is that the West recognizes that the 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed and Crimea are now Russian territory and will be Russian territory forever. Putin has made it clear that those two conditions have to be accepted to get a peace agreement. I find it hard to believe that Trump would accept those two terms. And if he did, that he could get support for that agreement in Ukraine and in the West, especially in the United States. So I don't think you're going to get a peace agreement. The alternative is that the war will go on, and at some point the Ukrainians will collapse, and you'll end up with a frozen conflict. And this will be a disaster for Trump because it will look like he lost the war. Joe Biden has done a brilliant job of kicking the can down the road so that when Ukraine finally collapses, the Ukrainian army finally collapses, Trump will be blamed, not Biden, who should be blamed. But these are the two choices Trump has. Either he agrees to Putin's terms and you get a real peace agreement, or the war goes on, Ukraine loses, the West loses, and Trump is in real political trouble as a result.
We had Doug McGregor on here yesterday, and we were asking him what his advice would be to Trump if he could give it. And he says that he should literally not care what anybody says in Kiev or elsewhere, and says, or his detractors here, because he also mentioned that same thing about what the Biden administration had clearly set up to try to blame Trump for what happens next. And he said that he thinks Trump should just say, okay, it's going to be those 4 oblasts. And I tell you what, we're going to stop all of our support. We're going to withdraw all of our military personnel and anybody else from Ukraine until you guys make a negotiated settlement on whatever terms you can get, whether they agree to or not. Because if Trump were to do that and to cut off the supplies, even according to what Zelensky said about 2 months ago, oh yeah, we wouldn't last 2 weeks. The war would be over pretty quick, which is ironically what Putin said about a year ago. Now that would be a really hard thing to do, and it would cause a lot of angst. But do you think that realistically speaking, that might be preferable to what would happen if the fighting continues from the Western perspective?
It would absolutely be preferable. It would be preferable from Ukraine's point of view. Ukraine has no interest, as you and I have argued on numerous occasions, in seeing this war continue. And I think what they ought to do is accept Putin's terms, in large part because they have no choice. They're losing on the battlefield. And continuing the war is worse than settling it now. The problem is that it's politically difficult, if not impossible, for Trump to do this. I think Doug is right in what Trump should do. Cut the deal now. But actually doing that's another matter.
Well, it certainly is, and that's why they're paying the big bucks, as they say, that as to be president of the United States. And I was actually on Tucker Carlson's show a couple of days ago, recorded rather than hadn't actually aired it yet. But one of the things that he said, it really stuck with me that Tucker suggested was when we were again talking about this issue of how things would be perceived. He said, I think Trump should just say, I don't care what anybody says, because I know that his political opponents are not going to like him. So he should just do what makes sense for his people and the people that voted for him. In large part, one of the big reasons was because he was going to bring this to an end. He said those people would be happy, and the other ones are never going to be happy anyway. So I truly hope that Trump takes that course of action.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. But my only point is it will not be easy to do.
I think it would be enormously difficult. But to your point about what happens if he doesn't, if he's not willing to do the hard leadership stuff and take the heat that for sure will come from a number of different quarters, not the least of which would be from some European capitals. I think you can probably add a few into there as well. But also, if he doesn't, forget about the heat that he could get externally. What may happen on the ground could be problematic. There was a little remarked upon in the West comment out of basically kind of a quasi-national security advisor for Putin, one of his senior aides. He's on the National Security Council. I think he's roughly equivalent to Jake Sullivan. He came out and said that as far as Russia is concerned here, there will be no deal done until all the tasks of what they call the special military operation are accomplished. And one of the things he said, a couple of things that were really noteworthy to me. He said, we are particularly concerned that the violent coercion of the neo-Nazi ideology, along with the ardent Russophobia, are destroying Ukraine's once prosperous cities, including Kharkiv, Odessa, Nikolaev, and Dnipropetrovsk. We call it Dnipro in the West here. It is not excluded that in the coming year, Ukraine will cease to exist at all. Now, that the selection of those cities is noteworthy. I'm gonna go back to the map here again, because I want to point out where those cities are, and also in light of something else that's happening here of late, and that is to do with Moldova. Now, he specifically pointed out Kharkiv, which is up here in the north, Dnipro, which is here, Mykolaiv, which is down here, and then Odessa, which is down here. You see all these are in this arc right here, which, by the way, this is the Dnieper River, which is coming down through here. And a lot of people have been concerned, actually from before this war, that eventually Russia would push all the way to the Dnieper River. Now, these are all well behind the lines here. And when he says that Ukraine could cease to exist as a state, that implies, and certainly there's been other information both from Sergei Lavrov as well as Putin in recent comments, that if they don't agree to what we call the 14 June line, which is what Putin said in June 14th of last year, where all the 4 oblasts will have to come back to their control. And these gray areas that we're showing here are areas Ukraine controls that would have to be surrendered to the Russian side, or they say they won't reach an agreement. Now, there is a lot of evidence, in my view, and this is what I'd like to ask you, that Putin almost put these lines out there because, on the one hand, they seem kind of reasonable, but also it would be incredibly difficult politically for Trump to agree to that, to just hand over territory that they haven't lost. But that Putin actually hopes that's the case, because he'll just, even if it takes another 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, they will eventually continue until they capture all of this territory. And these Kharkiv and Odessa especially are, by many Russian viewpoint, are Russian cities, and that's something that they actually want. How do you see that playing out, and what do you make of his comments?
Well, I've argued for a long time, Danny, and I mean a long time, that the Russians are likely to take those oblasts that are to the west of the 4 oblasts that they have annexed.
Yeah, no, I remember, by the way, one of the first times we had you on our channel, you said you thought they would take 8 oblasts, not just the 4 that they did. I remember that.
Yeah, and it may even be 9 or 10. It remains to be seen. They may not, but I think it is likely, I'm choosing my words carefully here, that they will take additional territory. You want to remember that as long as NATO continues to insist that Ukraine will be brought into the alliance, the Russians have great incentives to take more territory rather than less. They have a deep-seated interest in turning Ukraine into a genuinely dysfunctional rump state. And doing that is facilitated by taking more territory than they now control. And this is why you and I have argued for a long time, some sort of agreement should be reached now before the Russians take any more territory or have an incentive to take more territory. But nobody, of course, has listened to that. And we continue to talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that gives Russia a very powerful incentive to take more territory. And I think that is the direction that you're headed in. I think at this point in time, the Russians are concentrating on winning the war along the Eastern Front, as you described it before. And I think if they do take Odessa, they want to take it from the east. It is possible that somewhere down the road, they may use those troops in Transnistria to help them accomplish that goal. But I think that that is unlikely and not of great importance. The key question is whether or not the Ukrainian forces in the east will collapse, and that will allow the Russian army to move westward with relative ease. That's the key issue here. You know, when you were outlining the state of the war before and giving that excellent description of what's happening in terms of territorial conquest along the front lines, I was saying to myself, that's one dimension to the issue. The other dimension to the issue is the fact that the Ukrainians are suffering enormous casualties. I think much greater casualties than the Russians are suffering, in large part because of the imbalance in air power, artillery, and drones. And I think at some point, the Ukrainian army is going to collapse. You can see evidence that the wheels are coming off. And I think that once that happens, once the Ukrainian army begins to unravel, the Russians will be in a position to move eastward. And I think they know that, and that's what they're concentrating on. I think Putin has been very smart is keeping his eye on the ball, not getting distracted, not worrying about what's happening in Syria, focusing on what's happening in Ukraine. And I think that they're looking for an opportunity once the Ukrainian army begins to really seriously fall apart to exploit that opportunity and move into places like Odessa and Kharkiv.